I'm Gerhard Kasper, and I'm serving as president of the American Academy. And I have the happy privilege of introducing Marilyn Yalom. When introducing scholars, it is customary to talk about their present position, their education, and then selected titles from their bibliography. In the case of Marilyn Yalom, I shall reverse that order, and furthermore, I will not be selective, but list virtually all her books, beginning with the most recent. I do this because, as distinguished from most other books and book titles, and her publisher will be glad to know that, Marilyn's titles are captivating, and they will give you an idea of Marilyn's range. Now, I begin with the newest book, The Social Sex, A History of Female Friendship, about which we will hear tonight. Though, as you can see, no, here it's called The Social Sex. In our announcement, it said a short history of women as friends. So don't get worried that you will spend all night. Marilyn has decided to give you only a short history. Then we come to how the French invented love. Then we come to the American resting place, 400 years of history through our cemeteries and burial grounds. And when I said that her titles are captivating, I did not mean to suggest that the title of this one, which I read, by the way, it has photos by her son, it's a wonderful book, was that as captivating as to kind of make me wish immediately to go to one of these resting places and rest. No, not at all, but it was wonderful. Before that, we had Birth of the Chess Queen. You may assume the Chess Queen has been around forever, but not at all. She is no older than about 500 years, and Marilyn, I think, puts the beginnings with Queen Isabella in Spain. There are still countries that don't have a chess queen, but call the figure something else. Before that, a history of the wife. And before that, a history of the breast. And before that, the first book of Marilyn's that I read, called Blood Sisters, The French Revolution in Women's Memory. That was published 1993, and if it has not been translated into German, your German publisher should immediately get to work on that. Yes, she's sitting here, so you understand I'm doing several things. I'm multitasking, as I have to do most of the time. Actually, The Blood Sisters was based on a French book Marilyn had done 4 years earlier, called Le Temps des Orages, Aristocrates, Bourgeoises, and Paysannes Racontant. And before that, there was Maternity, Mortality, and the Literature of Madness. And also in 1985, an edited volume that she did jointly with her friend, the distinguished Anglicist Diane Middlebrook, known to some of you in this room, and that was called Coming to Light, American Women Poets in the 20th Century. There are more edited volumes, but I shall stop. Yalom's books have been translated into, I believe, 20 languages. A Chinese translation of How the French Invented Love is in the making. And it is up to you to speculate what impact, what cultural revolution that will cause in China. So how did she begin? Marilyn grew up in Washington, majored in French at Wellesley College, but also, while at Wellesley, managed to spend a year at the Sorbonne, where in 1953 she received a Diplôme de Littérature Contemporaine. About her first time in Paris, she gave a lively account that I will quote. I was at Wellesley College when I first went to France. That was a change from Wellesley, where we still had limited dating, had to be in by midnight in a very much retain your virginity community. Then off I went to Paris, where there was a latent sensuality, people embracing in gardens and sitting on the side of the Seine. And of course, the very shocking ideas of Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre. Freedom was the password. By the way, Marilyn, when I read that, it reminded me when I was a graduate student at Yale in 1961, Yale law students tended to date Wellesley women. And I think your description of limited dating still applied at that time in 1961. One of Yalom's German publishers refers to her as a feminist, a Proustian, and an early admirer of Simone de Beauvoir. All of this is true. And she got there via Wellesley, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins, where she obtained a PhD with a dissertation on the myth of the trial in the works of Camus and Kafka. Her advisor was the famous French cultural anthropologist René Girard, then at Hopkins and later her colleague at Stanford. From 1963 until 1976, Yalom served as a professor of foreign languages and literature at the California State University, to become in 1976 part of the founding generation at what is now the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford, where she still serves as a senior scholar. Marilyn and I have in common that we are both married to professors of psychiatry at Stanford. Marilyn's marriage has lasted many years, as has Regina's and mine. But counting the years of marriage in her case seriously understates the length of her relationship with Irv Yalom. Since she and Irv met in junior high when they were 14 and 15 respectively. Their love of books brought them together, and Irv, at age 16, made a bet with a friend that he would marry her. Now, I would like to say there were a few intervening years, but but nevertheless, he knew at age 16 that he would marry her. The rest is history, and now depicted in a documentary film called in English Yalom's Cure, with the even more promising German subtitle Anleitung zum Glücklichsein, Yalom's Guide to Being Happy. Like Marilyn, Irv Yalom is also the author of many books and has a large following, especially in Europe, including in this country. As all of Marilyn's books demonstrate, Yalom has been steeped in French culture ever since 1953. She has a great love for France in general and Paris in particular. You will therefore not be surprised to learn that in 1992, the French government made her an officier des palmes académiques, an order dating back to Napoleon Bonaparte. I find it difficult to think of Marilyn Yalom as a Napoleonic officer, but I join France in acknowledging her merits, talents, and exemplary activities.
Well, after such an introduction, what can I say? Except, perhaps a little correction. The chess queen did come on the board in Europe 1,000 years ago, not 500 years ago, but she became the most powerful member of the chess team, so to speak, under Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, listen to me, Queen Isabella, thank you for that correction. It's very moving for me to be here at the invitation of Gerhard, Regina, and the American Academy. This is such a special place. I feel as if I'm in a dream. And also to come here when all of the chestnut trees are in bloom, the lilacs, and this glorious temperature. So I'll take a breath and we'll turn to the subject that has brought you here today, and that is a history of women as friends, or what we have called the social sex. Those of you who are writers will know how difficult it is to come up with a title. And I must say that our publisher in the United States, Harper's, who has published several of my books, came up with the social sex, and then I wasn't really very happy with it until they came up with the photo for the cover. And the photo speaks 1,000 words. This evening, I'm also going to use some photos which are not in the book. And those I owe to my young co-author, who's not here today, who came on the project after I had been working on it for several years, and realizing that I simply didn't know enough about women's friendships today, that I didn't know enough about internet friendship, for example, or friendship in the workplace. And so Teresa Brown, who I say is not here with me, she really brought me into the 21st century. It's a lot easier for me to talk about the past. Although I'm not a historian by training, I like to look at things over time, 2,000 years at least, or 2,500 years. And this book goes back so many years to ancient Greeks, Romans, and the Bible. When we started collaborating on this book, it was from the premise that in America today, female friendships are valued more than ever before. And you have to look at that as a historic phenomenon. Today, when adults live large swaths of their lives as singles, that is, we marry later, if we marry at all, we divorce more frequently, women and men are widowed. So women have increasingly depended on their friends for companionship and support. And this investment in friendship, by women in particular, has been reinforced by the media in all the films you can think of, numerous films beginning with the iconic Thelma and Louise, and books like Toni Morrison's Sula, among others, and a slew of TV serials. If you were living in the United States, you would recognize them all. Seinfeld, of course, but things like Girlfriends and Sex and the City and The Golden Girls. I don't know if you recognize any of these. Some of you do. So today, friendship's a hot topic. And I'll talk more about that as I get into it. But there's a particular aspect that we take in this book, because if you ask anyone today in the United States, at least, and probably in much of the West, who have more friends, men or women, the answer is almost invariably women. We tried it over and over and over through the years. Now, this would have surprised people living in the distant past. In fact, almost all the documents on friendship, which I have been reading for the past 7 or 8 years, all of these documents during the first 2 millennia of Western history, from say 1600 BC to 1600 BC, pertain to men. Male authors extolled friendship as a male enterprise, necessary not only for personal happiness, but also for civic and military solidarity. And this is true from Aristotle to Montaigne. Men were praised as the noblest, male friendship was praised as the noblest form of human attachment. As for female friends, if you look at any of these documents, women were either ignored in their capacity as friends, or they were considered incapable of the steadfast loyalty required of friendship at the highest level. So we have called the first part of our book For Men Only. Because if you look at the public face of friendship, say in the Bible or in the works of philosophers and clerics, you will find only male examples. Let's see now if I can press down hard enough. Well, something has happened between the time I came here 2 hours ago and now. And I'm wondering if Sivan can give us a hand. What I wanted to show you, right? Okay.
Okay.
All right. He's going to play with it, and I'll tell you what you're going to see. The first image we've put up is one from the Bible, and it's a picture of Jonathan and David. No, that's not it. And they offered the paradigm of the perfect friendship in which, quote, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. It's a medieval version of that particular story in the Bible. Women as soulmates comparable to Jonathan and David are not visible in the Hebrew Bible, and that's despite the story of Ruth and Naomi. And they're almost equally invisible in the New Testament. We do hear mention of women who supported Jesus' ministry and the lovely story of the visitation. When Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, and John the Baptist leaped in her womb. But even here, the focus is squarely on the fetuses and not on the two women themselves. So we don't really begin to have records of women as friends until they themselves become literate and leave behind their own written records. The first substantial documentation of female friendship in the West comes from medieval nuns, such as Hildegard von Bingen. Her numerous letters, written both in German and Latin, testify to the close bonds she established with other nuns at the Benedictine monastery of Disse-Bodenberg, which she entered at the age of 14. Now, at first she was enclosed in a cell with her mentor, Jutta von Sponheim, and they were totally dependent upon each other. Jutta taught Hildegard to read and write Latin, and the two of them followed the Benedictine daily schedule of prayer, work, study, meals, and sleep. We know about this because later Hildegard wrote a book called the Vita Jutta with a monk. And interestingly, although we focus mainly in this book on women's friends with other women, there are examples of women's friendships with men. And the friendship that she had with this monk, Volmar, was very intense, and she called him a loving friend. And I love those words. We struggled a lot with vocabulary when we wrote this book. What words were we going to use? And often you find the words, a loving friend, and that holds up even today. Well, after Jutta died, Hildegard was appointed magistra of the women's section, and there were 18 women in residence there in 1140. They'd all come from noble families, You're probably aware of the fact that most of the medieval nuns did come from wealthy and often aristocratic families. They had servants, they had lay help, and Hildegard increasingly became confident of her own ability to recreate an all-women's community, and then she founded with the community at Rupertsberg, and there she continued to direct the lives of her female charges, including her favorite, Ricardus von Stade, who was her junior by 20 years. She wrote, while I was writing a certain book, I bore a deep love for a certain noble young woman. She joined herself to me in loving friendship and comforted me in all my trials. Now, that was a very intense friendship, a loving friendship, and it came to an end when Ricardus was elected abbess of another Benedictine monastery, and Hildegard was heartbroken. She did everything in her power to get her young protege back. She sent off letters to Ricardus's mother, to archbishops, even to the Pope, but to no avail. And I find the words which have, what should I say, which have been extant to this moment and collected in 3 volumes of the letters of Hildegard. She writes to Ricardus, my sorrow is destroying the great confidence and consolation I once had. Why have you forsaken me? The language is that of an aggrieved friend or a distraught lover. And over again in our study of female friends, we found examples of women loving other women passionately, though not necessarily sexually. The church, of course, always viewed particular friendships with hostility, and that was the term particular friendships, because it feared that such attachments would detract from many things, group cohesiveness, the love of God, and could lead to sins of the flesh. So we, my author and I, had to struggle with, what do we do about these very intense friendships? How do we describe them? And we wanted always, through this book, to use the same words that these women themselves would have used about their relationships. This was a loving friendship. Institutions like convents and later schools and women's societies were often breeding grounds for close female friendships. And of course, most of the records up until the last few hundred years come from privileged women who made up these groups. For example, we know a great deal about the précieuses, the precious ladies, so to speak, who congregated at the Parisian salons of the Marquise de Rambouillet in the 17th century. And these include, that's the Marquise de Rambouillet. On one side, Mademoiselle de Scudéry, another literary woman of the 17th century. And particularly these 2 women, Madame de Lafayette and Madame de Sévigné, 2 superstars of literature from the 17th century. Madame de Lafayette is the author of La Princesse de Clèves, The Princess of Cleves, a truly great novel. And Madame de Sévigné is famous for the letters that she wrote to her daughter and others. By the way, letters, not only those of Hildegard, but also of Madame de Sévigné, they were copied, they were circulated, they were semi-private events, so to speak. And there are 3 volumes of the letters of Madame de Sévigné. I always go to as much of an original source as I can find. The letters of Madame de Sévigné are amazing. We know that these 2 women were friends for over 40 years, that they were in and out of each other's homes almost daily when they were in Paris, that they kept in touch through the post when they were apart, that they supported each other through good times and bads. It's really an exemplary friendship. And I can tell you that as a professor of French literature, as someone who had read everything that Madame de Lafayette had written, I knew all about her relationship with La Rochefoucauld. I never knew that she was a friend of Madame de Sévigné's and a best friend until I started working on this book. And such are the things that get left out of literary histories. I was moved by the fact that when Madame de Sévigné was having trouble coming up with a suitable dowry for her daughter, Madame de Lafayette lent her the considerable sum of 500 livres, pounds, so to speak. And that's surely a mark of true friendship because it wouldn't be repaid for several years. Now, we can ask ourselves, where were the husbands in all of this? It's a good question, and again, one that we had to ask over and over again as we were doing this work. Well, Madame de Sévigné's husband, I shouldn't be laughing, was a notorious ladies' man who had gotten himself killed in a duel over his mistress's honor. And Madame de Lafayette's considerably older husband remained on their property in the Auvergne and allowed his wife to live a more or less separate life in Paris. At one point toward the end of her life, Madame de Lafayette wrote to Madame de Sévigné, "Believe me, my dearest, you are the person whom I have truly loved the most in all the world." Similar friendships were formed in the 18th century among British literary women who came to be known as bluestockings. And here is a caricature, of course, by a well-known British caricaturist, Rawlinson, of what he thought the women did at their literary meetings. By the way, there were also men at these literary meetings, and the word bluestocking comes from the fact that one of the men who was invited regularly couldn't afford the black silk stockings that the women wore, and so he came in his blue stockings, and then the women began to wear the blue stockings to make him feel comfortable. Today, there's a bookstore in New York where we read called Blue Stockings. And it's interesting that that term was something of a derogatory term, both in English and in French, for many, many years. But some of us have reclaimed it. So if we're interested in women other than aristocrats and literary figures, and we want to find out a little bit about the friendships among women who were what we would call working class or peasants, it's very difficult. You have to look at things like court. They didn't write letters, okay. They didn't keep diaries. Court records help, and one that I found enlightening had to do with Eliza Neal, who was killed by her neighbor's husband when she intervened during his attempts to murder his wife. We assume that the women were friends because the epitaph for Eliza Neal says, "To save her neighbor, she has spilt her blood, and like her savior, died for doing good." This is the first time it occurred to me that in order to get into the record, you've got to have been killed by your neighbor's husband. Well, it's not easy to find out about the private life of women or men, for that matter, who were not themselves literate. So we turn during this period, say the 16th, 17th century, to the works of men as well as women, and of course the works of Shakespeare are remarkable for the female friends you find in his plays. And these range from village gossips to high-born ladies. And he often placed them in situations where the women combined their forces to defeat male stupidity or cruelty. And let me just cite a few examples. In The Merchant of Venice, Portia disguises herself as a doctor of the law, and her handmaiden Nerissa, disguised as a clerk, plead Antonio's case, and they manage to save him from having to render his pound of flesh to Shylock. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, after the drunken reprobate Falstaff has sent Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Page the very same love letter, so he knew so little about women as friends. The two women, of course, compared the love letter, and they came up with a scheme to send him packing in disgrace. And another really beautiful example of female friendship is in As You Like It, when Cecilia and Rosalind talk about their friendship since childhood. This is what Rosalind says. We have slept together. Women slept together. In those days, nobody said anything off color. We rose at an instant, learned, played, eat together, and wheresoever we went, like Juno's swans, we went coupled and inseparable. Now, eventually, in As You Like It, Celia and Rosalind's intimacy recedes to make space for heterosexual love. And that's often the case in life as well as in literature, where we find that women are very close with one another and then they marry. And that presents problems because you get involved with your spouse, you get perhaps involved in raising children. So friendships often take a back seat. I can think of a woman who told me recently, she was a single woman in her 30s, and she said, "I'm hemorrhaging friends." All of her friends were getting married, and they were disappearing into their marriages. So that's an issue that one has to think about when you think about friendship throughout a lifetime. There was an English poet in the 17th century named Catherine Phillips, who went so far as to say, quote, "We may generally conclude the marriage of a friend to be the funeral of a friendship." So it's, as I say, it is a theme that one has to think about if you're thinking about the history of women as friends. Now, one thing I never would have thought of doing, but my co-author did, was to enter the words women friendship, or women in friendship, or female friendship for the years 1500 2008 into the Google Ngram server. And we found a total absence of the combination of those words till around 1750, as you can see on this chart. And then there are two important peaks, one around 1800 and the second between the 1960s and the present. And this became fascinating for us. We wanted to ask why these two peaks at least in the published words, women friendship. The first peak around 1800 is linked to Romanticism. And I don't have to tell you in Germany what the pre-Romantic and Romantic movements were. But they certainly encouraged people to feel deeply and to give copious expression to your feelings. And what came to be called, quote, romantic friendships between women were often as passionate and as exclusive as love affairs. And these took place around, starting with Rousseau and Goethe, and then going right into the around 1850. These women are called the ladies of Llangollen, and that's where the term romantic friendship originated. The 39-year-old Eleanor Butler and the 23-year-old Sarah Ponsonby were two ladies who left their Irish homes in 1778 with the intention of settling in North Wales. Their first attempt at flight was foiled by their families, and this comes from a letter written by one of Miss Butler's relatives. The runaways are caught. There were no gentlemen concerned, nor does it appear to be anything more than a scheme of romantic friendship. So in comparison to a heterosexual affair, a romantic friendship between two women was not the worst thing that could happen to the family name. And eventually, Miss Butler and Miss Ponsonby's families allowed them to move to Llangollen in Wales, where they lived together for more than 50 years. And they became famous as the ladies of Llangollen. In fact, they found their way into English poetry with the poetry of Anna Seward. She praised them for the sacred friendship that they enjoyed, permanent and pure. And Wordsworth also wrote about them in one of his poems. So to address the question that is often asked of us, Butler and Ponsonby's contemporaries did not equate romantic with lesbian. And that was a word that did not find currency until the late 19th century. Lesbianism as a term to describe the erotic practices between two women entered the vocabulary of social scientists around 1870s, as did the word homosexuality. And I think that the Germans are credited with coming up with the term Homosexualität around 1869. So in writing our book, we were very careful not to homogenize complex romantic friendships and turn them all into proto-lesbian relationships. We found it useful to think of romantic friendships as stretching across a continuum from committed heterosexuality at one end and uncompromising homosexuality at the other. And we didn't invent that continuum. It was first presented by the historian Carol Smith Rosenberg, whom some of you must know. I want to talk about one romantic friendship between two 19th century German women, Adele Schopenhauer and Sybil Mertens. I wonder if some of you have read this wonderful book, Geschichte einer Liebe, that came out fairly recently by a writer called Angela Streidler. And she wrote this book about their relationship. Adele was the sister of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and she was the daughter of a novelist, a well-known novelist in her day, Johanna Schopenhauer. And Adele was a single woman who became attached to Sybil Mertens, a married woman with 6 children. And they had a very close relationship throughout Adele's life. They would spend their summer at Sybil's country home in Unkel, which is near Bonn, I am told. I've never been there. And there, Sybil ran a salon with a circle of writers and philosophers and musicians and artists, while her banker husband remained in their primary residence in Köln. The two women had similar interests in culture and literature and archaeology. And what I found very interesting was a description of these two women by the English poet Anna Jameson. She portrayed them in this manner: opposed to each other in the constitution of their minds, yet mutually appreciating each other, both were distinguished by talents of the highest order and by great originality of character, and both were German, and very essentially German. English society and English education would never have produced two such women. So that gave me pause when I first read that. I thought, are there such things as national characteristics that come through even in friendship? What was it about these two women that struck the poet Anna Jameson as essentially German. I could go on at length in discussing this, but it reminds us that there are such things as national characteristics and traits. Not everybody has them. And there are such things as national characteristics to friendships. The things that we take for granted in the United States and in the West, that I get to choose my friends, well, that's not true for women throughout the world. There are places where women don't get to choose their friends, don't have friends, must remain within their own families, and perhaps they express their friendships differently. Maybe these two women were intellectuals like most of us here. Others might dance or paint henna on each other's hands. There are so many different ways of expressing the affection that people feel for one another. So we were always very careful to remind ourselves that what goes on at a specific place and time is not a universal phenomenon. I think the case of Sybil and Adele brought that home to us. I do want to say one thing that was very moving. Adele died in the arms of her friend at the age of very young. I think she was barely in her 50s. And Sybil washed Adele's body. Did I say that correctly? Sybil washed Adele's body, which is something women often do. You know, they're often the caretakers who wash the body and who bury the person. She placed it in a coffin in the Old Bond Cemetery, and she had the tombstone inscribed in Italian, which was their favorite language, with a text that read, "Here lies Louisa Adelaide Lavinia Schopenhauer after a life of 52 years, outstanding in heart, spirit, talent, the best of daughters and true to her friends. This monument was erected by her inconsolable friend, Sybil Mertens Schaffhausen." So it's a rare testimonial on a tombstone to female friendship. As Gerhard mentioned, I've written a book on cemeteries. I have never seen, in the 400 years of American cemeteries, I've never seen a tombstone inscription like that. Now, because we are limited in time, I will jump ahead to the end of the 19th century, to a new breed of women emerging. That's a chapter I can't talk to you about. It has a wonderful title, Quilt Pray Club. But, and I'll have to jump over to other good friends and here we go. So I'm jumping to the end of the 19th century, where this new breed of women called the New Woman or New Women arose both in Europe and in the United States. This woman was had as her symbol the bicycle, and it's no doubt that increased opportunities for education contributed to the formation of this new independent woman. Women's colleges such as Vassar, founded in 1861, and Wellesley in 1870, and co-ed universities like Stanford, founded in 1891, added a new level of rigor, for one thing, and prestige to women. And women's friendships blossomed in these institutions. Just met somebody who met her friend of 50 years in school, in medical school. And I will go on to Paris after this trip and meet my friend from Wellesley College of more than 50 years. So some of these colleges, whether they were women's colleges or co-ed colleges, did then and continue to inspire lifelong friendships. As one woman around 1900 put it, we live for our friends, and at bottom for no other reason. Well, I don't know if that's true, but the intense friendships that get formed in schools, and often that are that last a lifetime, is something that we had so much documentation for. In the Stanford archives, you see, Stanford University women's basketball, 1899, and Stanford's women's basketball is, I think, #1 in the country. We're very proud of that. Well, here we are, the women's basketball team from that period, and I could have spent days, months just going through some of the materials I found in the archives, but the one that remains most in my mind were the scrapbooks that women made around 1900, 1910, 1920. And my favorite was the one compiled by Hazel Trapagen, good name. It had one memento that literally stood out from the page because there was a smudgy envelope and it contained a piece of her friend Clara Black's wedding cake. So there was, over 100 years later, you could still smell it just a little bit. And she wrote about going to the wedding and that she was going to put the wedding cake piece under her pillow. And according to the superstition, she would then dream of the man that she too would marry. So one can look in archives going back to the Middle Ages, but some of the ones, even from our contemporary moment, are very vivid and certainly bring back a period that was the beginning for so many of us in this room. The new women of 1900 were aware that their young adult freedom would probably end with marriage. They would have to choose between marriage and family and a career. And as the scientist Alice Hamilton put it in 1890, quote, "The proper state of society is one in which a woman is free to choose between an independent life of celibacy or a life given to childbearing and rearing the coming generation." Well, clearly it's a problem that we're still struggling with today. Working class women, as you see from the paper mill girls' photos, they didn't always have that choice. They were often obliged to work both before and after marriage. And we don't have a whole lot of documentation on working class women, but we do have some from this period. They often counted on their friends as much as their families for shared living arrangements and for mutual support. One small autobiography that I found was written by Sadie Fraun, a Jewish-American immigrant from Poland, and she shared a room with a girl named Ella. Both girls worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a New York sweatshop making clothes, for which Sadie earned $4 a week and Ella $5. And Sadie wrote, "We had a room all to ourselves, paying $1.50 a week. We did our cooking on an oil stove and lived well. These two girls in their late teens managed to spend $1 a week on, quote, clothing and pleasure, and they put $1 away in savings." So it's this kind of document that one can find that gives us a picture of what women, of the way in which women lived together, supported each other, often until they were married. They were born out of economic necessity. Sometimes they did continue after marriage when the young women moved into the same tenement house in the same neighborhood. They depended upon each other for help with their children and for emergencies. And here's a little scrap of a description of two Irish working class families living in a New York tenement. "Mrs. H is very often in the house of Mrs. C, and they exchange many favors in the course of a day, while at night their husbands play cards and share the beer." Well, you know, it's just enough, it's just tantalizing enough to give you a picture of these two women, working class women, moving in and out of each other's apartments, coming in for a half cup of sugar or whatever, or coming in screaming and saying, "Help me, my child has fallen down the steps." And you know, some of us who have had children and careers, we know that we depended upon our neighbors and our friends for exactly those kinds of emergencies. Lovely couple that you may know, Vera Brittain and Winifred Holtby. They had an amazing friendship, which Brittain wrote about in Testament of Friendship. She also wrote another book called Testament of Youth that she's much better known for. That was about World War I. These were two women who had served as nurses and assistants during World War I, and they met at one of the women's colleges at one of the colleges at Oxford. And they became, again, friends for life, with one marrying and one not marrying. But this was I've thought about this a lot lately, that very often in the past you'd have one person who would marry and one person who didn't, and the person who didn't marry would become a kind of honorary member of the family, and that's what happened after Vera married. But the reason I'm mentioning them in particular is that Vera had an understanding that when she wrote Testament of Friendship, it was something original. And this is what she wrote. "From the days of Homer, friendships of men have enjoyed glory and acclamation. But the friendships of women, in spite of Ruth and Naomi, have usually been not merely unsung, but mocked and falsely interpreted. I hope that Winifred's story may do something to destroy those tarnished interpretations and show its readers that loyalty and affection between women is a noble relationship." The tendency, not only way back then among philosophers and even up to Montaigne, to disparage women's friendships has continued into the present moment with books like Mean Girls. And I mean, it's true, we can't deny that there are rivalries and jealousies amongst women as there are among men. But for the most part, women's friendships have consisted of loyalty and affection and interdependence, and I would say that the stock in women's friendship today is certainly on the rise. Maybe I can just say a few words, and then I'll stop in 5 minutes so that you can ask some questions about certain models of friendships that were around in the 50s and 60s. Now, in the 1940s, 50s, even a little earlier, 30s, friendship between two married couples became increasingly popular. Middle-class couples exchanged dinner invitations, they played bridge with other couples, and they even went on vacations together. Some still do today. So this kind of friendship, the friendship between couple and couple, formed the grid for two of the most successful television sitcoms of all time, I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners. The first had Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, who was her husband in real life, alongside another couple living in the same building, and they displayed all the gender stereotypes of their era with the zany interplay of the two couples. I'm curious, does anyone remember I Love Lucy? Oh, good. The second show, The Honeymooners, featured two working class couples living in a Brooklyn apartment with the comic actor Jerry Gleason and his stage wife Alice, and they played off their neighbors Ed and Trixie, and they demonstrated that four-way friendships were active in the life of more modest folks. So both shows offered the models of husbands and wives finding their best friends within close-knit conjugal units. But In the late 1960s, that model gave way to a new ideology that called itself sisterhood. With their slogans, protest marches, consciousness-raising sessions, feminists called attention to the specific needs of girls and women, and they treated many aspects of their lives, including friendships, with new respect. It was no longer politically correct to cancel an appointment with a girlfriend because a boy rang up and asked for a date. Women started marrying later. The age of first marriage in the 50s had been around 20, 21, and now it's more like 27. And as divorce became more frequent, women were single for longer periods of time. The demographics have changed so dramatically in the last half century. Women have come to depend increasingly on their girlfriends. And this has been true, I think, across the country, in some places more. I'm speaking about the USA now. It's just as true for white women as for black women. And this sense of sisterhood found echoes in an entire generation of women writers. I think in particular of writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor. And Toni Morrison, future Nobel Prize winner, reflected on this phenomenon in 1983 with these words: "Friendship between women is special, different, and has never been depicted as the major focus of a novel before her novel Sula." And since then, novels, films, TV shows featuring girlfriends at all ages have proliferated, maybe even to the point of near saturation. Well, I can't enter into the various manifestations of female friendship in our era, but I would like to look back over the past centuries and mention what we came up with as 4 attributes that seem to have been permanent throughout time. The first is affection. If you don't feel some kind of affection or attraction to another person, the friendship isn't going to endure. And the second is self-revelation. Women talk. You know, we talk to each other. Okay, we're in the old days gossips or chatterboxes or whatever the term. Women do talk to each other. They talk face to face, and they reveal things about themselves that they wouldn't necessarily reveal to their parents, their children, their husbands. They reveal to their friends. I would also say physical contact, that there's more physical contact between women. We touch each other. Sometimes we paint each other's toenails if we're in schools together, rub each other's backs, and as I said, sometimes and nurse each other. So I think that physical contact, kiss each other, hug each other, they're not on the mouth usually. And interdependence. I think that women are more interdependent with other women, with their families, with children, than were men in the past. Now, I say, I throw out these ideas, we throw them out at the end of our book: affection, self-revelation, physical contact, interdependence. Are these attributes the same for men? Interestingly, and I can say this with great pride, there's a new book out as of May 3rd. It's called On Friendship, and it's by the philosopher Alexander Nahamas, who's professor at Princeton. And it was sent to me before it was published, so I had a chance to read it. And I'm very proud to say that the first footnote in his book is to our book, to these 4 points. And he says, he thinks that men's friendships entail affection, self-revelation, interdependence. He wasn't sure about physical contact. That was the only one. And when I read that book, I thought, men's friendships are becoming feminized. That instead of insisting upon the public face of friendship, solidarity, military dependence upon one another. He's focusing on the inner life and on these qualities that, before I read his book, we thought of as particularly female traits. Well, indeed, maybe we are living at a time when even male friendships are becoming feminized. And I'd be interested in any of your comments on that or anything else I have said in my allotted time. So thank you very, very much.
Questions, comments? I will start.
Good.
Yeah. Was there somebody else? Yeah, please. No.
Hi, thank you so much for such an interesting lecture. I have a question, especially with this beautiful last picture at the Beamer about the political importance of friendship. As far as I know, the concept of friendship, like philia, has for a very long time had a very political import, and was wondering if, maybe I'm very wrong, but if we talk about friendship and women friendship after the 1960s, if the term of friendship have maybe also gone through like a process of commodification perhaps and privatization, and that the more political component has been articulated rather in terms of alliance, for instance, or allyship or solidarity. So I was wondering if you could say something, because what I really liked was the way how women friendship has often been considered a threat, right, to patriarchic society, the blue stockings, all that stuff. But it seems that recent considerations of female friendship have lost somehow that critical touch. So I guess what is the political importance of contemporary female friendship?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. In the American tradition, women have come together very often for political causes. If you think of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they were best friends. If you haven't read the autobiography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I really recommend that you read it, because she spends 2 chapters talking about her friendship with Susan B. Anthony. Hull House, am I saying the name right, in Chicago, the first settlement house in the United States, that was founded by Miss Adams and her friend, and then a second friend. There was a picture of her. And so many of the progressive movement achievements were founded by 2 women together or a group of women. So that what we think of as the women's movement of the late 60s, it did give a public face to friendship. After all, the word was called sisterhood. And sisterhood is powerful. And I think it was a movement that started with the assumption that what we do personally is political, the personal is political, and that friendships should be aware of that what we do, the way we treat each other as friends, has implications beyond our individual lives. So, that's a subject in and of itself, and someone could write an entire book about it, and I think it would be very, very interesting. I don't know if I've answered your question, but at least I've tried to touch upon it.
Hi, my question is, what did you learn about the more recent, how the internet has affected women's friendships? And are you on Facebook?
Well, my children have put me on Facebook, but I have to say that I'm not a big advocate myself of Facebook. It's a matter of time. You've got to get into it, and you've got to read what this person said about that person. And one of the reasons that Teresa Brown was the person I asked to collaborate with on this book is that she knew a lot about internet friendships, social networks, and she wrote the chapter in our book on social networks. And I was very skeptical about the phenomenon to begin with, because I thought, how many friends can you have? In fact, I know there's another slide here. These people have 1,000 BFFs, best friends forever. So I was skeptical. But what I've learned is that some of these people who meet on Facebook or whatever the internet is, sometimes then meet afterwards, face to face. And that can become a more lasting friendship. And some, Teresa ferreted out some really interesting examples of how people, a certain group of people, they supported someone through her breast cancer trials. So I've come away with more respect for what can be done on the internet. That's where we are. I mean, social network is what is happening.
I was wondering if you had looked at sororities in the United States specifically,
yes.
and if you had any interesting findings. I'm right here.
There you are. Hi.
And if you had any thoughts or findings on sorority friendships.
Yes. Sororities have played a very big role in the United States, particularly at the big universities, the big state universities. And I don't know if they still exist at Stanford. I know fraternities did for quite a while.
They were recreated by me.
Yes, well.
Because it was a discrimination issue. The male fraternities continued, and then we had, Stanford had abolished sororities in the 30s. And when I was president, women came and said, "Hi, how come they can have fraternities and we cannot have sororities?"
Right.
So we reinstated it.
Yes, so I do think that at co-ed universities, they serve a purpose. People do want to gather with members of their own sex, and it's complicated. I mean, Gerhard could speak to this issue so much better than I can. You know what's happened at Harvard recently and at other universities where they're really doing their best to get rid of the privileged clubs because they feel that, particularly the male clubs, they have disadvantages for the people who are not members of those clubs, not to mention all of the pledging, the hazing. But I certainly, in talking to many people over the years, women who were at co-ed institutions and who were at big state universities, felt that the sororities gave them a special kind of home. So I don't know how to answer that question. I went to an all-women's college that did not have sororities. But and this is what we were talking about the other day, people tend to gather with others whom they see as similar to themselves. And whether it's a matter of educational level, whether it's a matter of socioeconomic standing, whether it used to be more a matter of religion, whether it's a matter of race, it's very hard to break through these barriers in friendships. You can do what you will as institutions, and I'm all for that. But ultimately, when it comes to a person choosing a friend, most people, it is birds of a feather flock together. Gerhard, is that about where I should stop? No? There are other questions? No, I'm happy to, but I just don't want to keep people longer than they're accustomed.
My question was, did you do any research in terms of looking into children's books? Because there are many, many books, both about boys and girls, going back quite a ways about the friendships and the strains in friendships.
Yes. Stand back here so that everybody can hear me. Friendships are so important for children. Once you send your child off to school, I do think that the peer group has more influence than you have. And that's practically from an early age. And to have a friend means everything to a child. And I do think that these books for children about friendships, I can still think of one that I read to my children. A friend is someone who likes you. It began that way, and I read it to each of my children. And you have to feel So, that's the first stage, is it not? To feel that somebody likes you. And if that person likes you, that you will do almost anything to maintain that friendship. No, I think children's books have been very important in helping parents understand what children's friendships are about, and helping children cross some of those boundaries that I was just talking about. The one child in the class who's different, either for any number of reasons, and the development of empathy. It's a big subject these days, everywhere, and of course it has to be. And I think of what Germans are doing in bringing in people who are different in appearance and in religion from Germans historically. How do you teach a child? How does the child learn that person who doesn't look quite like him or her can be your friend? Not easy. So I don't think I've answered your question, but there are many, many books out there today, great books for children that can help them understand that they can make a little bit of an effort sometimes towards someone who doesn't seem exactly like him or her.
Right, and no, that's definitely an issue. I guess I was also thinking about in terms of taking women's friendships seriously.
Yeah.
It seems to be more acceptable going back even to like the late 1800s and early 1900s to depict those friendships in children's books.
Yes,
than perhaps
you're quite
grown-up
right.
ones.
You're quite right. And the friendships, they become so intense in middle school. Oh my God. At that stage, they're like love affairs. So that's where it gets very, very tricky. Everything gets tricky in middle school, but friendships in particular, people tend to be very cliquish. I'll just tell you one thing from my own experience. We all look back at the things we could have done differently, and I always think to myself that I was not very nice to another girl who was even shorter than I was. And, I think there was a little projective identification going on. I didn't want to be associated with her. I was always the smallest in the class, and then along came this other girl who was even smaller than I. And to this day, I think, I really shunned her. So, I'm sure each of us can think of some moment in your past at which you could have been a little nicer to someone else.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating discussion and subject. I'm thinking about, in some ways, the other side of the coin. I know certain women who they're harder on women because they're women. Some who I know, they see Hillary Clinton on the television, they'll say, I'll never vote for her. And there's this quality to it that it's almost, because she's a woman, they're holding her to another standard that they wouldn't hold a man to. And that's older women that I know. But then some younger women, I was at a conference earlier today, and there was a discussion about how in Germany and other countries there's this attempt to have women appointed to boards of directors of corporations and having slots for women. And there's a certain amount of younger women who say, no, that's not right. Women shouldn't be treated specially. You have to, make it on your own, and there shouldn't be any kind of slots like this. And again, they're thinking about, and there's no knowledge really, or awareness, or wanting to admit that there's issues of historical discrimination there. Why you would want to do this? Instead, there's just this sort of gut reaction about women being treated as women and being treated differently. Any thoughts on? It's just puzzling to me, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on it.
It's a huge, 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 huge subject that you're raising, and I certainly can't come up with any particular answer. It is true that you have a queen bee syndrome amongst certain women, and I have seen it. I was the first woman in the humanities in a group that had 20 men in a fledgling state college. And I think for a little while there I enjoyed being a queen bee. But I was I was smart enough to realize that many of the women who were applying for positions in this brand new state college were outstanding. And many of them, as myself, were geographical prisoners. And so sometimes they were a lot better than the male candidates. And we ended up hiring, quite a number of women in the humanities. And of course, once you have the experience of being both a queen bee and then having other women around you, you can build a support system. And that it can be very, very powerful. So, when the time came to start looking into things like, not for myself, well, actually, maternity leave and extending the tenure clock for women at universities if they were pregnant, they ended up at Stanford getting an extra year, but all of that was late coming. So you're kind of you can be drawn in two directions, that to enjoy being the only woman on the board, but you can get beyond that, particularly if you recognize this interdependence and the sense of solidarity that can accrue from having more than one woman. It's a problem. It's not one that's going to be easily solved, but I think we're moving in that direction.
Marilyn, I want to take you back to the beginning of your talk, yes. And I have a question related to that. And that is the expression of feelings in letters and so on, and you gave some examples from women writing to one another, mm-hmm. And they can express strong feelings, and then those of us who were not part of that period or not part of the period are wondering, was that a sexual relationship, was it a lesbian relationship or whatever. And I know this mostly from letters of men, let's say early 19th century. Yes. I have read a lot of the letters from the founding generation. And for instance, as prominent a person, as we all know, Alexander Hamilton, wrote letters to fellow officers when he was in the military that were like love letters.
Exactly.
And so you read them from a contemporary perspective, and you wonder what went on there, right? So the question I have for both men and women, but I knew it in particular from the men, what is the role of language and the openness to express feelings and the changes in that? We don't write like Hamilton anymore. So say something about that.
Yes, I think that's a really important question, because the rhetoric changes according to the time and the place. If you were to read the letters of Saint Anselm around 1100. To his fellow monks, he talks about missing them, and I missed you when you came to the monastery, and I had already gone on to England. I would have kissed you, I would have embraced you, the physical expressions. And people have jumped on this and said, well, this is homoerotic, and what was going on between him and this man, or this man and that monk. That was not only the rhetoric of the time, but remember, these were semi-public letters. Those letters were copied and circulated. So if you take a letter out of its context, like the letters of Hamilton, you can read anything you want to into them. But I think you have to think of them as to what were the letters of the other people like at that time. Now, Hamilton, he's already into the romantic rhetoric. People were writing each other, I love you, ich liebe dich. It just went on and on and on like that. And then towards the end of the middle of the 19th century, that rhetoric dies out. And customs change. One of the ones that I really loved the most was a letter written by a woman around 1900. And she described the practices in her girls' school. if Mary Jane smiled at me that day, that she's looking back 50 years, that made my whole week. We exchanged rings. We cut off locks of our hair for each other. And she said, I don't know whether young girls do this anymore today. So, you have to really look at the historical moment and not immediately assume that the relationship was homoerotic or physical. I mean, we have so many ways of loving. And I use the word love. Again, I learned a lot from my co-author. She's a married woman with 2 children, and she said to me when we first sat down, she said, I love my friend Rhonda. And I said, well, what do you mean by love? She said, I love her. She said, it has everything about my friendship with her except for a sexual relationship. But there are relationships that are sensual. There are others that are, quote, platonic, which is a distortion of the original word. And, veering over into the sexual or the homoerotic. And I learned so much in writing this book, particularly thinking, what would it have been if I had been 14 years old or 10 and sent into a convent and never knew anything but other women? I'm sure I would have directed whatever love I have towards the other women. So I've been fortunate in that I've had some very good women friends, that I've also had some very good male friends. Thank you.
I will entertain one more question. Yeah, please.
I have an observation and a question. Listening to your very interesting presentation from an Asian perspective, it struck me that this theme could not possibly be a theme of interest in Asia. And the reason why I say that is because I come from a culture where traditionally the genders socialized separately. Friendships between women were, just like you having a brother or a sister. That was so essential. So, and even though much of Asia has changed in the name of globalization or modernization, and we do mirror our social interactions now more like in the West with couplehoods and all of that, that strong tradition of friendship among women, I mean, that's just, you don't even talk about, it's so given that it would not be a topic of interest, basically. So that was the observation that I wanted to share with you. And then it made me question, well, what is it about the Western culture, I mean, in a very gross way, that would make this topic? Why is it that the relationships between women, friendships between women, is considered to be rare, or I mean, for you to find it worthy to explore scholarly, yeah.
Well, for one thing, I've lived long enough to see a change in my own lifetime between the fact that if I had been a teenager, when I was a teenager, and if I had a loose date with a girlfriend, and my then boyfriend, who became my husband, would call up and say, oh, but can we do this Saturday night? Oh, I'd call the girlfriend, I'd say, oh, I can't see you, because I'm going to be off with Irv. That wasn't true for my daughter. I noticed that there was a point of honor at which she would never cancel a date with a girlfriend for a male. That just was not acceptable anymore. I think there was a little bit of feminism that worked their way. So I've seen in the course of my lifetime how, one could say negative things about women and about, oh, they're always jealous and they're rivals and this and that. And that has changed, at least publicly. And the sense that women count on their friends in a public way Now, the very fact that we are single for so much longer or for single for a lifetime, I think that's made a difference too. You may not have seen this series called The Golden Girls, but it's a crowd of older women living together. And there are more and more relationships like this, more and more living relationships like places which are springing up. There are books about how you can form a community with other women. So I think that there have been enough changes, even in the past half century or 60 years, so that we have a historical phenomenon putting more emphasis on women as friends. And God knows how many times in whatever interviewing we didn't do scientific interviewing, somebody would say, I would have never made it without my girlfriend. So maybe that's always been the case in Asian countries, but maybe we are beginning to appreciate women as friends in a new way.
There will now be wine and some dessert. And probably if it is it raining out there, then it can go out on the terrace and in the garden. Thank you.